In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please have a seat. Well, certainly happy Mother's Day to all of those of you that are mothers. We're so appreciative of you and all the wonderful sacrifice and investment in our lives that you make. Of course, Father's Day is coming up again in June as well, so it's going to focus on parenting here in a few weeks. And our readings actually kind of get us into this topic a little bit. And I want to talk about an aspect of parenting today. Let me ask this question for you to consider. For those of us that are parents, what is the aim of our parenting? What is it we are seeking to accomplish in terms of having children and raising children and launching children out into the world? What is it we're expecting to happen in that? What is a product, if you will, that we're expecting to launch out there? And the question, too, comes to mind, well, why do we have children in the first place? And I've got to say, I think, for me at least, the answer, when I was having children would be different than it is today, okay? Very different reasons, I think, and that's part of development in that. But I would say from today's perspective, what children mean to me in terms of why we're in this thing together is to produce mature, life-giving relationships with these particular people. Dare I even say it, having a deep friendship with these children. Now, that's a lofty goal. And I've got to say, over the years, doing this for about 40 years in terms of ordained ministry, I've encountered a lot of situations where parents and children really don't get along at all. I mean, there's no friendship at all. They're not even good enemies. And I remember in one case, a person I knew that it was declining in health and finally got to the place where they were beginning to die, and having spent some time with them and hearing their story, and they had a relationship. This was a man, and he had a relationship with his son that was not a relationship. It was actually hostile. They had not seen or communicated in years. He's on his deathbed, had no intention of reaching out or having any contact with this child. And at his death, his son didn't come to his funeral. And I think, how tragic. What is the point? What is the point of parenting if that's what it looks like and that's the way it ends? Well, one thing about parenting is it's not automatic. I mean, we know it's real simple to have children, to have them, physiologically speaking. But it's a very different thing to invest one's life in developing those children. And that's where we very intensely need God's help and God's shepherding and God's leadership to put us in a place where we can develop our children to be all that God intends for them to be. But in order for us to invest in them, it has to start with us. We can never give away anything that we don't ourselves have. If we're not in a solid place and have the capacity to actually be friends with our children or anybody else, we can't invest that in our children in a way that they become those kind of life-giving people in the world. And so, now to talk about how do we get to that place in our own lives? How do we get to that place where we have this capacity to invest? And it's not automatic at all, by any means. It is the Christian journey that allows us to develop into that capacity to have friendship with anyone. Interestingly enough, we hear in our gospel today that Jesus has in mind something beyond just a friendship between people, but a friendship with God, a profound thing. Now, what does he say about that? He says, "You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing, doesn't understand the master's purposes. But I've called you friends because I've made known to you everything that I've heard from my Father. I've made known to you the purposes of God. But it's interesting that Jesus ties friendship with God and with himself to obeying the commandments. And that seems a little counterintuitive to us in some ways, doesn't it? We think of keeping commandments, that rigidity, and kind of being made to do particular things. How can we be made to be a friend? And we see in the readings too today, the command to love one another. How do you command somebody to love somebody else? Well, what we need to understand is our default position is that we don't have the capacity to do any of those things. The potential is there, but the capacity is not. And so where we start out is to be discipled, to be taught, to be trained, to be developed, so that we develop that capacity in order to be that kind of a person to our children, to our spouses, to our actual friends, to ourselves, and to God as well. Now, I'm going to take a little step back and talk about something that is not going to appear relevant at first. It is. Okay. Trust me, I've done this before, right? Have you ever heard of the Monks of Skeet? These are some monks that are in New York State, and they're famous for raising German Shepherds and training German Shepherds and other dogs. They've been doing this for 50 years as a way to fund their monastery. They've got some books out. In fact, their most famous one is How to Be Your Dog's Best Friend. Your dog's best friend. Some of us think it's easier to be a friend with a dog than it is with people, right? But there's a story behind this. I've known about the monks and their way of training dogs for decades, actually, and kind of employed the bit that I knew about that, and I've recently read all their books. But where it really came home to me in terms of what they're doing, how unique it is that about, I'm guessing, 11 or 12 years ago, our Bishop, John Howard, who had actually come here, he was the vicar of Trinity Wall Street when he was elected the bishop here. And when he was still up in New York City, he used to go to New Skeet to do retreats. So he got to know the monks really well. And he wasn't really a dog person in particular, but he appreciated what they did. And about 11 or 12 years ago, he gets a call from one of the monks there and said, Bishop Howard, your dog is ready. And he said, what dog? He said, well, we have been training for a little over a year, one of our dogs, and we want to give it as a gift to you. Now, you have to be on a waiting list to get one of their dogs. We want to give you this dog. Neshma is her name. I'll tell you, when I first saw this dog, amazing. I've never seen a dog like this ever before. Because the way they raise them is that there's discipline, and they're teaching them the commands. But they do that. They leash them to their waist, to their belts, and they follow them all day long, following the pattern of their lives. And they learn that they keep very strict, kind but strict discipline about what's allowed and what isn't allowed. When I saw Bishop Howard's dog, they used to take everywhere. He would to diocesan events, certainly the office every day, and even often to parishes, though he never brought Neshma here. And this dog was amazing. I mean, he would process down with his crozier and his mitre on, and Neshma just walking right alongside him. No leash or anything. And she might wander away at some particular point, but she'd always be looking to where the bishop is and make her way back to the bishop. And he's preaching. She'd be lying down there content and quiet the whole time. When he's celebrating the Eucharist, she would be right there at the side of the altar. Amazing dog. See, even to the point she was taught that when they were going through a door that she had to wait for the bishop to go through first. Amazing. I said, man, I want a dog like that. And yet the training of these dogs, it's not as though they automatically, we know, if you just leave a dog to their own devices, you're going to come up with something that's very different than that. Unfortunately, in the philosophies, most people don't really know anything about actually training a dog. They get a dog and they just do whatever seems to be natural, whatever seems to come to mind. And usually it's the wrong thing. Because the monks of Skeet point out that dogs are actually pack animals. Deep in the core of their being, they're pack animals. And somebody's got to be in charge. There's a pecking order in every single pack. And if you are not the pack leader, they abhor a vacuum, and they will take over the leadership in your home because there's a lack of leadership. And that's when you get dogs who have not been trained, but they're in control of the house and they're out of control. And it's not their fault. It would be ours. Now, you bring that into parenting. How do we learn how to be a parent? We know anybody can have a kid, but how do you really parent them? How do you know how to do that? How do you give away something you don't have? Is there a manual like the monks of Skeet have about dog training? Well, we could say the Bible is, so you have to kind of find your way as to what it would say about those particular things. But certainly, the Christian journey is that manual that allows us to learn the commands of God, to be shaped, to be leashed to our God, to be a servant of God for that period of time, that we learn the heart of God, what it is that God has in mind, what we ourselves are intended to be, what our wiring in fact is. And we start with the commands in order to be free to then follow as friends instead of merely servants. It's about developing a capacity. We know, we could go on and on about situations of people not having the capacity and yet being given something very precious. So, suppose somebody wins the lottery. You hear this story over and over again. Somebody, they're buying the tickets every week. It's their retirement plan, right? We're going to win the lottery. And eventually they do, and they get millions of dollars. But they haven't personally been trained about how to manage any money. And they notoriously go through this money in about 2 years and end up just as broke as they were before. They don't have the capacity to manage it. We can apply that to all of our life. That if we're going to be a friend to anybody, we have to develop the capacity of friendship. And the Christian journey helps to mold us into that, of realizing, well, it's interesting in the readings today that there's a command to love other people, a command. That sounds like a rule, but we know that love isn't that sort of thing. But certainly what that command does, it says, I've got to take seriously that I've got to love everybody that's in my life. I've got to take that seriously. It's on me to learn what that means. God, help me. Help me to be that kind of loving person. And we see transformation by the Spirit to happen in all these dimensions of our lives. So we move from being a servant to being a friend, even a friend of God. Now, when we look at, if you were to look up characteristics of friendship online, you may get different lists. Some would say, 7 keys or 12 keys or 24 or 25 characteristics of what it means to be a friend. And they contain things like this, of having mutual acceptance, of active listening, of having good boundaries where we're close but not enmeshed, of learning the ability to compromise, of embracing forgiveness, both giving and receiving forgiveness, of mutual respect, of support, of truthfulness and honesty. And without those things, you're not going to have any kind of depth in a friendship. I mean, you can have friends, you can have your drinking buddies, but that's not friend in itself. Friendship is much deeper and more profound. And many of us don't have the capacity well developed to be a true friend. I've been fortunate that about 40 years ago, when I was a new priest, I met a Christian leader, not an ordained leader, but he's become my closest friend. And I was actually with him at Live Oak fishing about a day and a half this weekend. And you know, it's really interesting. It's got these kind of characteristics, but neither of us kind of started out being full-blown in that. We had to take it a step at a time and learn, and as Christian men, applying these various commandments of laying the groundwork and the baseline for us to have something that now is developed into something that is easy and natural and life-giving. It's just a breath of fresh air in our lives. When we come into a relationship with God, we naturally come into it untrained, unfocused, unmanageable, out of control, willful, stubborn, everything an untrained dog would be without proper leadership. We're the kind of people, just like those dogs, they open the door and they're out of control when the guest comes in. Can't do anything about it, seemingly. And that's our natural state. Without the leadership that God provides. It's about developing the capacity. All have the potential, but we've got to develop the capacity through our walk with God by the Spirit. Having those qualities built in us where we can be a friend to our children, to our spouse, to our true friends, to ourselves, and even, ultimately, to God. And frankly, it starts with a friendship with God and filters out in the other dimensions of our lives. Do you want to be a better parent? Do you want to be a better child? Better spouse, a better friend, a better version of you? If we learn the lessons of servanthood, take the command seriously, being leashed to the master, and learn the master's ways, we'll find ourselves moving from being leashed there as a servant to being unleashed as a friend of God. If we learn the lessons of servanthood, we can learn to be friends with God, forever changed in our capacities for friendship in all the dimensions of our lives. Going back to the bishop's dog, Neshma, I have never seen Neshma on a leash, ever. And the most contented, in control, loving dog that I've ever observed in my entire life. And never have I seen her on a leash, because she learned the lessons of the leash wonderfully and transformationally. When we're trained by God, we won't break and run. We're less likely to be distracted. And we'll come to learn and understand that God does not want to harm us, does not even want to restrict us ultimately, but to lead us into being a true human being a friend of God and being a great friend to all of our core relationships. The bottom line is God only wants to make you, you.